Not that we needed any more confirmation, but we got it anyway this week. The deep state is real. And what we mean by that is deep state in the sense of bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats running the government instead of democratically elected leaders. And so I think a bunch of things happened this week, which all in their own way confirm that. I mean, starting with Victoria Nuland, who is now out at the State Department, and she kind of epitomizes this person within the foreign policy establishment that runs everything, who was never elected to anything. And then, of course, we also had the news out of Canada with their lab, which was sending all these viruses to Wuhan, as well as an article out of China that confirms that the Wuhan virus, the COVID-19, did not start at the Wuhan seafood market, which we all knew. But again, it just reinforced this idea that Fauci and other deep state bureaucrats were in charge of that. They covered it all up. And then lastly, I think we should also talk about the CIA, which of course built their secret bases in Ukraine, in a way fomented the war over there. And again, these are not elected people. These are completely unelected bureaucrats and Washington, D.C. insiders. And so I think the pattern that really emerged this week, again and again, is that deep state bureaucrats really run the show. What do you think?
Well, first of all, this is something that it's not like new news to either you or I. I think what's important is now this is starting to get broader exposure where kind of everyday Americans are starting to get real glimmers of this. I know for myself, we've talked about this before. I'm curious what your response is, but I know when I first started this as kind of a hobby and was looking into Russiagate, and we're talking about 2015, 2016, I feel like it took me almost a year to fully accept what I was seeing as I began to uncover things and dig into documents. In other words, at the time, it was so against my perceptions and the fact that fundamentally there are no good guys in Washington, that everybody is, kind of acting as one, that I sort of had this refusal, like a cognitive dissonance, where I couldn't bring myself to immediately accept it. It took a while. And now I think that same process is transpiring for the general population. And I also think that one of the reasons that we're seeing this come forth, it's twofold in my mind, maybe threefold, but there are things that are all kind of coalescing at the same time. We had COVID, and now the information on COVID is beginning to filter out, and the broader population, I think, for the most part, realizes, hey, we were lied to in one form or another. Like, we may not know how serious it was, but we know that the government was dishonest. And, the other thing is the election. As more information filters out, more and more people realize that the election was, it was fabricated. In my opinion, not trying to speak for you. And, then third is what we have going on with Ukraine. And people seeing this desperation to keep this Ukraine war, which, if anybody looks at it objectively, I think it's pretty fair to say this thing has been, I think both of us feel like it was never winnable, but it certainly doesn't appear to be winnable now. And this incessant desire to pump more money into the machine to keep things going. And I think all of these things are getting people to start to sit up, notice, and ask questions. And, some of this concern around the machine, maybe something we could talk about, epitomized by Victoria Nuland appearing to get, almost kind of looks like she got pushed out as opposed to just decided to retire.
Yeah, it does appear that way, which kind of would be surprising, but I think there's quite a bit of evidence for that. Before we do that, I just wanted to, pick up on something you said there in terms of these kind of the Overton window expanding on these hoaxes and on the fact that the deep state bureaucracy does run kind of everything. And I started off kind of where you did, where at the beginning of Russiagate, if you told me in 2016 that there's this FBI agent called Peter Strzok who is working overtime to undermine the Trump candidacy with, FISA warrants and spying on campaign aides and so on, I would have said, that's not possible. So, of course, we learned a lot over the past few years. But, one thing when you mentioned that reminded me of something that happened this week, which is, of course, the Whitmer hoax was further exposed. The idea that, there was these right-wing extremists in Michigan who wanted to assassinate the governor over there, Gretchen Whitmer. Well, it turned out to be an FBI entrapment scheme. And so this week, tapes were released of the chief kind of FBI operative, the insider that they had infiltrated into this group. He was being threatened by his FBI handler not to sort of say what really happened. And the handler even says, and this is on tape, that the FBI is not in the business of kind of truthfully figuring out what happened, but is in the business of building a narrative. And that this guy helped them build that narrative that somehow these right-wing extremists wanted to assassinate Gretchen Whitmer, which they didn't want to do at all. It was the FBI informant who was kind of prodding things along. So
well, that was part of the big news, right? Is it the transcripts make very clear that it was the FBI informant who was driving the entire process, and the FBI was driving the FBI informant.
Exactly. And when that story came out, the other day, it was okay, kind of we knew, but it was also impressive to hear those tapes, because they are, I mean, even after all these years of being used to all these hoaxes, in this case, we're talking about the FBI, again, unelected bureaucrats, pushing a political agenda, deciding political questions, deciding which candidate wins, which candidate they support. I mean, obviously, Peter Strzok, we can go all the way, 8 years back when he was doing that. Well, they were still doing it in 2020 with this informant. But what struck me when I read that, it was like, hey, wait a minute. Trump believed that hoax. And then, of course, there's that tweet from 2020 where Trump sort of highlights that this was a dangerous situation that Whitmer had been put in. And he was upset with her for smearing him, despite, the FBI having uncovered this hoax. So isn't that amazing that, just a mere 3.5 years ago, people still believe these kinds of things? So I think that just underlines what you were saying, that the Overton window has expanded and expanded and expanded further. Or if we turn it around, the belief in hoaxes has sort of narrowed more and more, where we're now at the point where if there's one of these hoaxes or suspected hoaxes, most people will just say, well, it's a hoax, prove otherwise. Whereas, even just a few years ago, the assumption would have been, oh, this is bad, This is a huge movement, I think. It's been very slow, as you say. It's been like drip, 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 but it's, Nuland, let's start maybe with her.
You know what? Actually, if you don't mind, maybe just for 1 minute, because I think you've touched on an important point, is this manifestation of the shift. And it's something that I've been noticing a lot. Obviously you have as well. But think about, it was just a few weeks back, and Mike Rogers out of Congress comes out and he wants to get Ukraine funding done. And what happens? He throws out this vague classified threat regarding Russia, and it's really, really bad, and we can't tell you about it. And everybody was immediately dismissive of it rather than taking it seriously. And as it turns out, it was kind of bullshit that Russia's working on some space technology. We'd already really known that, but he phrased it as something, really dark and ominous that was going to be people were speculating on all kinds of things, but for the most part, they were laughing about it. And that's a huge change that's happened. And I've noticed it's more than Elon taking over Twitter, now X, is that the pushback that's going on out there against sort of what I view as the establishment figures on both the right and the left, not trying to forget about politics, but, establishment figures. The pushback that's going out on the tweets that they're sending is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And frankly, I would encourage anybody who's not doing it, take advantage of that. Get out there and respond, mock these people. Chris Murphy comes to mind. He's busy trying to pretend that the fake border bill was a real bill, and his underlying goal is funding for Ukraine. And when you go underneath his responses, these guys are getting tattered. People are attacking them right and left, mocking them. And again, I've never seen anything like it. And it's indicative of this widespread movement that we are being lied to by every one of our leaders.
That's right. But then we get back to the fact that those leaders, Chris Murphy isn't running anything.
No.
And neither are his colleagues. And I think we get back to the fact that it's the deep
Chris
state
Murphy's being run.
That's right. It's the deep state that's running things. And look at what happened. I know we wanted to come back to Nuland. We'll do that in a moment. But, look at what happened with the CIA having all these, building all these secret bases over on the Russian border, right? That entire New York Times article that exposed that was written by the CIA via Adamantis. I mean, he was just a stenographer. And the entire reason for writing that was to get more money. So they are basically turning the screws on people in Congress. So they're the ones who are really running things. And I think that part of the story has not fully kind of filtered through yet. It probably would take another few years, but we're moving in the right direction. And I think Nuland and the reaction to Nuland, resigning, we'll get back to that word here in a moment, but shows me that we are kind of inching our way towards the point where people are realizing these kinds of people, like Victoria Nuland, never elected to anything, yet run everything, and that's wrong. That's just fundamentally wrong. And that was one of the reactions I noticed this week. So what happened, just to recap, is that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, sent out a message, a statement, and the statement said, on the resignation of Victoria Nuland, and then it just says, how wonderful she is, and she's always been at the State Department doing all these wonderful things, and well, now she's leaving. So that was kind of strange, because normally it's always about more time for the family, wants to get more involved in charitable work, something of that nature. And it doesn't say anything like that. It just says she's resigning. And resigning, it sounds so final, doesn't it? It's kind of like, they're old now, they're going to go off and live somewhere on a golf course and we'll never hear from them again. Just kind of, that's not her. I can't for a moment imagine that she approved that language. So,
well, it's also important to note that it was Blinken that sent the announcement out. It wasn't as if Victoria Nuland was issuing a statement, I'm grateful for all my time at the State Department, et cetera. I think to both of us, this sounded pretty dismissive. Now, it's possible that she's just trying to get off of a sinking ship. It doesn't prove that that's not the case, but this felt different. And the fact that it came from Blinken and it didn't have a coincident statement from Nuland, I think led the both of us to think, well, there's something underlying and she was shoved out for whatever reason. It's also a good point maybe to raise on Nuland, because she's a great example. We were talking earlier about the fact that, it's not a matter of right or left, but establishment. Like Nuland's is, kind of as you said, the epitome of a swamp creature. She's worked under Dick Cheney. She's worked under Bush. She's worked under Clinton. She's worked under Obama. She's worked under Biden. She's worked under everybody but Trump. It's not the politics in terms of left or right. Her job is endless wars, create narratives and, keep wars going in some far afield place where the United States can, exercise their warmongering through various proxy nations. And that's kind of been her job. And that's what she did. And it wasn't related to politics specifically.
And I think, you're right. I mean, she started under Cheney, then she became NATO ambassador under Bush.
Yeah.
Then she was back at the State Department under Obama. But I mean, I think the pivotal moment here in time, which to me has never gotten enough attention, even though it's now more than 10 years ago, was when she organized a coup in Ukraine. I mean, that is probably what history will remember her by, at least I hope so. But it also really captures this idea that completely unelected people that many people in the public who don't follow this stuff every day have never heard of. If you just go and ask kind of Joe Public, who's Nuland? Most people wouldn't know that, right? And yet she's the one who pulled the trigger on Ukraine back in 2014. And I mean, to me, that not only epitomizes that she is the deep state, she just encapsulates that whole concept, but also the kind of environment where we live in, where this isn't widely known, this isn't widely reported. No one seems to, bat an eye about that, like, oh, whatever. Just for those who might not have heard, there was a tape that was released at the time in February of 2014 of Nuland telling the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine, a guy called Jeffrey Pyatt, that there would be a new leadership in Ukraine. At the time, there was still an elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who the Ukrainians had elected, democracy and all that stuff. And there was an argument about a trade agreement, which is it's a policy decision. Let the Ukrainians deal with their policy. But no, Nuland didn't want that. So she chose this new guy, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and he was her guy. And she told on this intercepted phone call, she told the ambassador, we're going to replace Yanukovych with this Yatsenyuk, her hand-picked leader of Ukraine. And a few days later, exactly that happened. I mean, you couldn't have had it more clear. Like, you couldn't have had a more smoking gun. And yet, hardly anyone even knows about this whole episode.
It seems like the people who do know about it, it's a growing list, but like, pick a step back in time. It's probably Russia that released that tape. We're not positive of that, but that's the most likely scenario. And she was even discussing, okay, we're going to have these other candidates. We'll have them work at, like Klitschko. We're going to have him work on the outside. He'll be better there. Every single thing that was discussed on that phone call happened. But it's also worth thinking about the fact that she's kind of the interface in my mind. In other words, Victoria Nuland isn't by herself such a powerful figure that she was able to orchestrate everything. She, at least to me, she has to be kind of the interface with the CIA and everything else. All of these plans were probably started back in 2013 because this call happened in very early 2014. So there was probably already an immense level of groundwork that had been laid behind that. And she's kind of broadcasting that. It's like she's talking to Pyatt and saying, hey, all right, here's the plan in place. This is what I think we should do. And by the way, to make this all go nice and smooth, we need to bring in Biden. And we've talked to his representative and Biden's willing to do it, which of course began Biden's whole tenure and experience in Ukraine, where he immediately set up shop and got to work using Hunter Biden like he did in China. It's a repeated pattern, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
And to add to that, there was the $5 billion which had been approved for Ukraine through the State Department. It's kind of a slush fund. I mean, they called it like, supporting NGOs, supporting democracy, whatever, just some rubbish terms. But in effect, that was $5 billion to seed the revolution over there, or the coup d'etat. And you're absolutely right. That happened. The $5 billion happened before the phone call, so this was in the works for a while. And I agree with you. She's more of the sort of the person who executes on these plans. But nevertheless, you need such a person, and she still epitomizes that. And she made it happen. By the way, on the topic of one of the reasons that this phone call has not really been publicized much. By the way, the Biden tapes as well. Biden talking to Poroshenko, hugely incriminating, yeah. And you hardly ever hear about it. But in fact, YouTube just deleted all these tapes off of their site. So one of the things about the Nuland tape, where she discusses the coup d'etat over there, the impending one, was that Russia was blamed, as you say, and it might have been. Maybe some Russian intelligence services, intercepted that and recorded it. But who cares? I mean, who cares who this is the Assange argument.
Yeah, it doesn't matter that Russia, if Russia
cares
leaked
whether
it.
Julian Assange or whoever, what matters is the content, what is being said here. And this whole idea of Russia, and therefore we shouldn't listen to the tape, is just ridiculous. The tape has nothing whatsoever to do with Russia. The tape has a unelected State Department official planning a coup d'etat in a foreign country. That's what the tape is. It's got nothing to do with Russia. And the same story, by the way, happened this week as well, where did you hear about the German military officials were using a chat app, Chinese chat app, and surprise, surprise, the information that they were exchanging on that app, they even chatted on that app, ended up being leaked. Oh, surprise, surprise, don't use Chinese apps, right? But Russia is being blamed for that. So what the Germans were doing, which, by the way, given their history and, that in living memory, all these atrocities that Germany was committing in Ukraine and in Russia in the 1940s, so within living memory. And now the Germans, what the tape was about, they were discussing blowing up the Crimea bridge and using, advanced German weaponry to do that. Just completely unreal. But again, if you look at the media, and as far as they reported it at all, it's like, Russia tape leak, Russia. Got nothing to do with Russia. The whole point is that the Germans were discussing blowing stuff up, Russian infrastructure. So that is, that's the same pattern over and over.
It shows you the power of the media, the fact that they literally are able to craft these things in a way that the public looks right past the actual facts that are in front of them and focus on, whatever they want them to focus on, whether it was Russia or China did a bad thing, as opposed to looking at the underlying actions that were actually taking place. And, you mentioned earlier, like you talked about Adam Enhouse, and there's other ones. Nakashima is another one that jumps to mind. And I've really kind of shifted my opinion on these people. There's an old adage that the intelligence community tends to leak to the Washington Post, State Department, DOJ tends to leak to the New York Times, and that's gotten somewhat blurred now. But there's a few key reporters that I don't think of them anymore as reporters. These are very gifted, very smart, very, very competent people. They're not good people, but they're very, very competent. And I actually think of them as effectively IC elements that are embedded at the papers. And they always are the national security correspondents. And there used to be kind of this adage that, oh, well, they sort of became friendly with their correspondents in the intelligence community over time. I don't really think that anymore. These people know everything that's transpired. Ellen Nakashima was involved in the Aspen Institute pre-planning for the release of the Hunter Biden laptop. Of course, she never reported on that, but she did all the planning for the release of it. I don't see these people. There's certain reporters, I don't see them as reporters. And not just propagandists. I see them as actively engaged or part of the intelligence community at this point. And they were at least tremendously effective.
And the deep state, the wider deep state, because they're the ones who aren't reporting on Nuland. They're not reporting. We haven't talked about Fauci. We haven't talked about all the COVID news this week. We'll do that here in a moment.
Yeah.
But the media, they're supposed to be the ones reporting about that, and they're not doing that. So they are, at a minimum, collaborators, and possibly more. I agree with you. Some of them seem to be completely embedded into, we keep using the word deep state. I'm not a big fan, by the way. I'm not a huge fan of that particular term, mainly because it's been so abused over the years, and it's almost gotten this label, again, through the media, but it's sort of got this label that somehow is, if you say the word deep state, then you're like some sort of tinfoil hat nut. So that's the problem I have with that word. I wish we had a kind of a better word, but
I've been using the establishment. Yeah, it's not perfect, but
the problem with the establishment is that that includes all these politicians who are. One of the arguments here is that they're the ones who are supposed to run the show because they're elected, and they're not running the show. So we need to distinguish a bit between politicians and sort of the bureaucracy. I would say,
if we're trying to be specific, I say the intelligence community, because they're the ones that I think feel are directing
it's not just
things.
that. Look at the public health establishment. That, up until like a few years ago, that was not intelligence community, or is not all of it. Maybe small parts of it. I think it's more than just the intelligence community. I think it's kind of entrenched bureaucracy, but it's not a nice term. The deep state has a much nicer ring to it. Eventually, we'll get to a better word, and eventually, as this filters through more and more into the broader kind of general public's perception, which is, I think, what we're saying, that this is happening bit by bit. A death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing. Eventually we'll get there, and then eventually we'll hopefully have a better word than deep state, or the word deep state might be, rehabilitated. Remember how the word fake news was seeded by the Clinton campaign as a word of, anyone that supports Trump. And then Trump turned it around into the fake news is the Washington Post and New York Times and all those people. So that was lovely. But it was done early.
Whatever word we're trying to come up with here, I think what we're talking about is an agglomeration of sort of the defense elements and the intelligence community elements, and a fusion of those two things by and large that are directing most of the other things that influence the larger foreign policy and the directions, the integrations with Europe. A lot of this seems to be driven, in my mind, by, unfortunately, in opposition to the Constitution and embracement of supranational laws that overarch and expand beyond and subsume our national laws. But
you had Eisenhower, who started it.
Who was it? It might have been Mike Benz, who I thought said it fairly well, that every time that you hear the word democracy, that we're defending democracy, what they're really saying is they're defending the way things are. They're defending everybody who's in power, that runs, that, kind of fundamentally runs things, that's what they consider democracy, and that's what they mean by that. And that's what they're trying to preserve and protect.
I think that's right. Let's go back. Eisenhower started with his warning about the military-industrial complex. That was kind of the beginning of, what is the deep state. I totally agree that the intelligence community kind of might have already been sort of part of that and became like a full-fledged part of it pretty quickly. You got all the CIA scandals in the 60s, 70s, but instead of being fixed, the problem just kept getting worse and worse and worse. But I think and we really talked about the media, whether it's a full-fledged element or not, we can debate about that. But I think another important part is just the bureaucracy. The fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people who just want things to remain the way they are. Not everyone at the NIH, for instance, at the National Institutes of Health, is a Fauci acolyte or is as corrupt as Fauci. But 99.999% of them just want things to be the way they are. And what that means is you always just pull in the same direction as where Fauci's pulling, and you don't rock the boat, and you draw your money, you're unfireable, you have a nice life and all that. And that has become a huge problem in itself. And for instance, George W. Bush was a major person who, a major contributor to that. Remember how after 9/11 he expanded the whole kind of Homeland Security. Well, he created Homeland Security. He created 200,000 new jobs there. He turned Virginia blue, because where do all these people live? They all go and live in Northern Virginia, right? And then ever since then, Virginia turned blue. But I'm kind of digressing here. The point being that you have the bureaucracy as well. They are an integral part of this. So at a minimum, you have military-industrial, intelligence, media, and bureaucracy.
Well, one of the things that I think we've kind of both come across is sort of twofold. I do think the CIA may have taken a bit of the lead, and I think that has a lot to do with sort of the average intelligence quotient that is there, present there, as opposed to other places. We found that a lot of these people, Strzok is not some Superman, super FBI agent. He's not particularly bright. He's just very well placed. And that I think that holds true for a lot of these people. They're not, there are some very, very smart people in key positions, but a lot of these people aren't particularly smart, but they have this innate understanding of how to all, as you said, pull in the same direction. A lot of times there doesn't need to be a grand implemented plan. Most of these people sort of intuitively understand the kinds of things that they should push back against. And they just kind of do it as part of their existence in their positions. And, you see that with these institutions when you come in and you try to change them and you meet this incredible resistance. And sometimes it's organized, and in certain areas it may be more organized than others, but it's also just the entrenched bureaucracy having almost a natural responsive reaction to any sort of change that's being pushed upon them.
And the penalty is always immediate. And everyone was taught that lesson early on with Linda Tripp, who was the whistleblower against Clinton and his White House affair. Now, she's probably not the best example because of the content of the whistle blowing, which is like some guy had an affair. Okay, he was the president. Okay, it's not quite the same as creating COVID in a lab or whatever. But I think the lesson was still learned because she was part of the entrenched bureaucracy. She'd been around forever. And then she was absolutely hounded after that. And, I think she was fired or pushed or, it was, and her life was made an absolute misery for speaking out of turn. So they all know, don't speak out of turn.
Yeah. I was actually going over I was talking to somebody that's, within the government area, and I was kind of angry about something. I just sort of responsively said, is there just nobody who's a good guy within the entire DC system? And unfortunately, by and large, the answer is no, there's not. I saw Matt Getz tweeted out something about he wants Inspector Horowitz to pick up a new investigation. And I sent out a response to that because it was something that was just, it kind of epitomizes what we're talking about. I'm getting a little off topic, but it has relevance. Horowitz sat down and did an interview with who were the two people? It was Woodward and, another guy. And during that interview, which was not widely seen, I'm seeing if I have it here. Oh, it was Jack Goldsmith was the other guy. So two people that are totally anti-Trump. And here is Michael Horowitz doing this hour-and-a-half long sit down with them. And he's very, very buddy-buddy. And every time they would slam Trump, he was in complete agreement about it. And he also even raised the issue about how Trump was wrong to fire Michael Atkinson, an inspector general, the guy that brought forth Eric Ciamarella as a whistleblower, wrongly protected him, wrongly designated him as a whistleblower. The point of all this is here's even somebody like Michael Horowitz, which I think a lot of people, kind of hold up for his reports on the FISA abuse and everything else. When he gets on a one-on-one personal level and he lets his guard down, he's just as much of a swamp as all the other people. And unfortunately, that's kind of what we're up against. It's everybody. It's not, 2/3. It's pretty much everybody.
Yeah, look at what happened with the Horowitz report back in 2019. He knew right away that the whole thing, Mueller, Russiagate, the whole thing was a complete scam.
Yep.
So, for instance, he knew that Steele had no source. Well, or that Steele's source admitted that this was all just a big joke. But he only said as much as he needed to sort of, not everything was done right here with the Carter Page FISAs, but he never said anything more. He never said more than, he ought to have said more, but he kind of stopped himself. So it's like, it's that whole, protecting institutions or whatever you want to call it. For instance, what he did not tell us, now he might say he didn't know, but I find that difficult to believe, is that the FBI hired Steele's source, Danchenko, in order to conceal him from everyone. That was the whole point. It's totally corrupt, and not a word about that in the Horowitz report. Now, I agree. Everywhere you look, you come across these people, and nowhere do you come across just an honest person who speaks up. And whenever you do, they get fired, they get victimized, and then that sends a message to everyone else not to do that. And maybe we should move on here to COVID, because we had some big COVID news this week, and it again reminds us that there were so many people, and now we're just going to talk about the bureaucracy here for a moment. So many people within the bureaucracy who knew that about the cover-up, who knew about what happened in Wuhan,
yep,
and who did not speak up. And that's really part of the problem. So one of them is, for instance, Tony Rock. She is a U.S. government employee. She was involved with the diffuse proposal, where Daszak and the people in Wuhan had this idea to insert furin cleavage sites into coronaviruses. Well, that's never happened before. And then a virus shows up with exactly that feature, COVID, right? She was involved in that proposal from the start. It was in 2018-19. U.S. government employee, like in some department. Did she ever speak up? Did she ever say, hey, like in early 2020, hey, guys, maybe you should look at this? Nothing whatsoever. And so what happened this week is that two things happened. First of all, this is, to me, I'm just kind of not shocked, but not surprised. A Chinese group published early sequences of COVID, which they recovered from early patients. So for 4 years, the Chinese authorities had hidden. As soon as COVID broke out, they said, delete all the sequences. The guy who wrote the article, they actually shut his lab in January of 2020. Anyway, after 4 years, I don't know exactly what the dynamics are there, but after 4 years, they did finally, through this article, release those sequences, and they show that whatever they found at the market, which was always suspected to be just spreading a virus that was seeded elsewhere, and we knew that, everyone knew that, but now it can be proven because they found sequences predating the market. So the thing, in other words, the thing just didn't start at the market. So that's what the Chinese article shows you. Why are they allowed to publish it? Are they putting themselves at risk? I don't know. I don't know the dynamics there, but what is very obvious, and this is the shocking but not surprising part, is that all these people in the U.S. bureaucracy who've been covering that up, as well as, Fauci's scientists and so on, are less honest or more dishonest than people in China who have, families and threats of jail, and, they live in a totalitarian country, and yet, they're more honest. So that was, pretty shocking in itself. And then, of course, the other thing was the Canadian lab where they had Chinese scientists working there, and lo and behold, these Chinese scientists were secretly shipping off virus constructions, man-made viruses, over to the Wuhan lab. And then a photo emerged, which we'd known about this photo earlier. It was from an event at the Wuhan lab a few years ago, before COVID, where all the people that we always talk about, they're all in the same photo. Daszak and Xi Zhengli and Ralph Barrick and all these people. Anyway, turns out that these guys from the Canadian lab were also in this photo. So again, this is 4 years later. No one spoke up. No one blew the whistle. No, nothing. So it seems like in Canada, the problem of the sort of entrenched bureaucracy is, just as bad as in the U.S., as it is, by the way, in Europe as well.
Yeah, I saw something else as well, because it tied up with that. Barrick was in that picture, right? And we've always been clamoring, why hasn't Barrick been dragged forth in all of this? And we've also talked about how the email requests, the FOIA requests for emails out of the University of North Carolina, how that institution, which is where Barrick's lab is at, that they've been fighting tooth and nail to have those released. And now there was an article that came out that says that they've actually, the FBI and I think it was the DOJ, have assigned sort of these overseers to provide an extra layer of protection on these FOIA requests. That for specific topics, they're actually having people that are designated to look at, to prevent stuff from coming out, and what does come out, that they're making sure that it's fully redacted as it needs to be, which is the whole, kind of extra layer of protection. The FOIA process is ludicrous, but the point is, this type of cover-up going on at a very high level. And you mentioned about kind of the deep state knowing everything. Well, we know that the State Department independently came out in April of 2020 and said, hey, this thing came out of a lab. And what does the intelligence community do? They immediately respond with their own statement, which covers up everything the State Department said and changes the entire narrative back to a natural origin, and kept it that way for a whole year. We see this just happen time and time and time again.
Right. So you have, we spoke earlier about a State Department official, Victoria Nuland. Of course, not just her, but we focused on her. State Department officials, unelected, never seen, no one ever voted for these people. That's state. Now we're talking about public health officials, NIH, NIAID. No one ever voted for these people. No one even knows who these people are. Before 2020, no one had heard the name Fauci. Maybe some of the people involved in AIDS research had, because his involvement with that, and some people maybe had remembered him from something else. But he wasn't a household name or anything. And yet we found out that these people run the show. And so this is different. The State Department, and now we're talking public health. And then, of course, then we have intelligence as well. And, there's this overlap, as you've already mentioned a few times. And I think a great example to do with what you just mentioned, that State Department paper that COVID came out of the lab, April of 2020. So a couple of honest people within the State Department. But again, this was just internal. They did not have the guts to send this out, publish this, even though Trump was president. And yet no one had the guts. And I think one of the reasons why no one had the guts, we talked about Linda Tripp and so on earlier, people getting fired, people know what the consequences are if they do something like that. But I think there's always the constant reminders of what you're not allowed to do. And I think the reminder back in April of 2020 was Richard Grenell. He was Trump's handpicked director of national intelligence. Trump was saying that this thing came out of a lab and he'd seen the intelligence, and we assume that tied in with what the State Department put out in their paper. And by the way, there was a secret Pentagon paper as well that said the same thing. And yet Trump's own DNI goes and says the opposite in his statement on April 30th, because he's not really in charge. Other people are in charge. Other people, and he admitted in a few years after that, he admitted in a tweet, this is Grenell, he admitted that he had to negotiate his statement about COVID. Why do you have to negotiate? You're the DNI. You're not supposed to negotiate. You're supposed to just put out what you want to put out. No, he had to negotiate. And that tells you, right? Other people are in charge. And of course, the statement that was put out was like totally natural, no question, and so on. That was the statement they put out. And at that point, if Trump's DNI, Richard Grenell, who was supposedly this terrible, you know how Senate had held up his nomination for years and he was cast as this evil MAGA guy and whatever.
It still is.
If that guy cannot get himself to tell the truth about COVID, well, is some State Department lower level official who has access to the report that it came out of lab, is he going to leak that? Of course not. I mean, everyone is always shown the way, and the way is, you just keep to yourself and you just don't speak up.
And that whole memo came about, that intelligence community statement on COVID came out because the State Department memo was actually leaked to one person, wrote an article about it. The intelligence community immediately jumped in, got a statement going. Leg swept Trump as part of that. They didn't tell him when they released it. So you see these kind of responses. But one thing that I was thinking about in terms of this control mechanism, a lot of it comes back to money. You mentioned NIH. NIH controls the purse strings over all the grants that go across the scientific community. And we're not talking about small amounts. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars that are sprinkled across the scientific community. And, the scientists, unfortunately, know where, they get their money from. And they're very afraid of upsetting that cart. Another area, you mentioned the NGOs back in the Ukraine situation. Well, the State Department is also funding all the NGOs that have been set up shop down in Central and Central America and through Mexico that are funneling the illegal immigrants into our own country. We're literally paying for that. And the mechanism, the way that happens, is these omnibus bills, which designate huge amounts of funding for these institutions. We have a designated amount for the UN, but what most people don't know is departments like the State Department gets these huge discretionary budgets where they can literally allocate $7 to $10 billion that they are then able to allocate as incremental contributions to the UN or specific contributions to the NGOs themselves. That's outside of the formal funding. And, it's this incredible amounts of money that's washing through DC on more or less an off-the-books, unaccounted for basis that enables a lot of this power structure to operate.
Now, we're kind of still left with this one question, which we haven't answered and which probably we cannot answer. And maybe we should try. Take the Grenell situation, for instance. He admits that he had to negotiate his own statement. So who's really in charge? Who is running all this? And who's running the COVID cover-up? Is it Fauci or is it someone higher up? Who's telling Nuland that to replace Yanukovych with Yatsenyuk? All these many examples we discussed. Who is that? So my theory is that it's more like it's like an ant colony. There isn't someone. It's like everyone knows what they do. The system has sort of taken on a life of its own. What do you think?
Yeah, I think their response, I do think that there are some highly placed people that probably have much more direct action, and we aren't entirely sure who those people are. But that, as you said, kind of that ant colony responsive reaction to things. It's the system, and the system is in essence an entity unto itself that's sort of achieved intelligence. And a good example, like the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, when that was established, that was supposed to be like one guy with maybe a staff of, I don't know, hypothetically 5 to 10 people. That's all that office required. Well, guess what? That office grew rapidly in just a couple of years to be several thousand people. And these are the people that work there full time all the time. The DNI comes and goes. Those people do not come and go. Why did that happen? Because there was too much concentrated power. If you just had a politically elected director of national intelligence who was the centralized figure for everything, that allows a lot of power within one politically elected official. The system can't abide that. And they naturally build up an entire base around it. And it's that base that operates on a daily basis.
It's actually, the DNI office is a perfect example of how these things go wrong and how the system kind of, it's like a black hole. It just, gobbles the whole thing up because ironically, the whole reason for having a DNI was to bring the intelligence community in line, to bring it all in line. That was the whole point. Because after 9/11, everyone was doing their own thing. And the idea was, and by the way, it wasn't portrayed as everyone is doing their own thing bad thing, but at least some of it was bad. But I think it was a broader idea. Everyone is doing their own thing. Let's bring it all under one umbrella, so that we're all doing the same thing. We represent the interests of the United States and its citizens, and we have to pull together. So that was the whole idea of having it. And now we have a situation where the DNI is still it's there like a figurehead, but is then being run by
It's not being run by the DNI. Exactly.
That's correct. I mean, and I guess the constituent, I mentioned ant colony, and I think on a broader scale that is true. I mean, you mentioned it's grown into like thousands of people, so that's a symbol of what happens in DC. Something that was supposed to be 5 people, and suddenly it's like 5,000. Don't quote me, but something like that.
It's about 3,000. When I looked into it, I was shocked.
Madness, but you have, part of that under that umbrella is supposed to be like CIA, for instance. And of course, the CIA has their own ideas, and they probably have a lot of leverage. And I'll just always come back to that word. When Grinnell admitted that he had to negotiate his own statement, it's just so telling as to what goes on in that office. And yeah, you're right. They're not running it, but it's remember there was Grinnell's successor was John Ratcliffe. So just a little ray of hope here, in my view. Yes, the system is running it. It's like an ant colony. It does its own thing, but it's not impenetrable. What you need is a very strong-willed person, a very strong persona to push through and forge through. And Trump has some attributes of that nature, but he doesn't have self-control or patience. So that's you kind of need both. Now, Ratcliffe I thought he was pretty good. There were some things he didn't do. He wasn't just great on all fronts, but he was pretty good at least showing that you can break through with persistence and tenacity and so on. And what I'm thinking about is the disclosure about Clinton's plan. Remember that in October of 2020. And so this was the fact that Brennan's CIA, so this was a direct conflict between CIA and DNI. So Brennan's CIA had gotten a leaked message or an intercepted message in 2016 that exposed the fact that the Clinton campaign was planning to smear Trump with Russia collusion. So that, but the moment they got that, sometime in July of 2016, the moment they got that, it would have been known to Brennan. And by the way, he shared it with Obama as well. So Brennan, and also shared it with Comey. So Brennan, Obama, and Comey, and Strzok, so all 4 of them knew that Clinton had this plan to falsely smear Trump with Russia collusion. At that point, July of 2016, everything that, Russiagate is supposedly about, Steele dossier, Papadopoulos, all that Manafort, is gone. Is gone because, it's Clinton. It's a Clinton smear. So it was known. But we didn't find out about that until October of 2020, when John Ratcliffe released that information. He released the fact that Brennan knew back and Obama knew back in July of 2016. Now, the reason why I say that is because there was immense pushback. I mean, if you read some of those, Washington Post articles at the time in 2020, right. Like, national security, Ratcliffe was told he was jeopardizing everything. Ratcliffe was told not to do this. The CIA pushed hard.
Ratcliffe was putting America at risk.
There must have been this monumental struggle back in September, October 2020, not to release this, because of course this is huge. The media didn't report it as such, but this is so massive because it exposed Clinton as being behind everything, and the fact that the CIA, the FBI, and Obama knew. And the fact that Ratcliffe managed to get that out is that just that little ray of hope.
Yeah, and it was more than that too, because what we found out through Ratcliffe was that it wasn't just that they knew on the 28th before the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was open, but that they took actions to then cover it up. So rather than either just saying, okay, everything's horseshit, we're not going to do any investigation of the Trump campaign, or what they really should have done, start investigating the Clinton campaign, they went entirely the other way and protected and siloed that information so that it couldn't get out to protect the Clinton campaign as they embarked on the investigation of the Trump campaign. So it's even worse on every level. And you're right. Ratcliffe was castigated for that, and he's a traitor. He was exposing information that put the United States and our national security apparatus at risk. No, well, he was in the sense that if people really understood what was being revealed, could get to the underlying aspect that our intelligence community is not working for us. But, that is a threat to them, I guess, but not in the sense that it was being portrayed.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's really worse than that. People forget. So Obama and Brennan and Comey get this information that Clinton has a plot, has a scheme to smear Trump with false accusations of Russia collusion. And then just at the same time, this guy, Christopher Steele, who is a paid Clinton operative, just happens to walk into the CIA, into the FBI, says, "Oh, look, where's your dossier?" And then a few weeks later, Michael Sussman, a Clinton lawyer, known as such. That wasn't even, with Steele, it was a secret, but with Sussman, it was known. This is a Clinton lawyer, walks into the FBI and says, "Oh, Alpha Bank," with all this phony Alpha Bank story. It couldn't have been more obvious what was going on. And then to find out that they even knew because of the intercepted communication is just so terrible. So great for Ratcliffe that he got that out. It shows us that you can beat the system if you're tenacious enough. But very, very bad because it's, in a way, this still hasn't kind of broken through into the mainstream. Most people, what we just discussed here for the past 5 or 10 minutes, most people have no idea that actually happened. Now, I hope that a person like Ratcliffe can do what Ratcliffe did for the Clinton plan for COVID origin, because given everything we've heard over the past few years, and we've said this many times, we don't need the Wuhan lab to confess. We have all the information that is needed is in Barrick's lab, is in the intelligence community documents and so on. It's all in the United States. So it just needs someone.
Yeah, the intelligence community continues to hide behind all the evidence is at China. We're never going to get that. So, guess what? We can't get the answers. That's nonsense.
That's right. So anyway, let's hope a good DNI emerges and is able to do a little bit on that front. Now, that won't reform the system. It will take a lot more to change the system. But at least I think these little pinpricks can be very effective, especially if you do it like regularly and on these big issues like COVID origin. Most of all, because of public perception. If it turns out that, as I'm sure it will, that the United States intelligence community knew from day one that this thing came out of the Wuhan lab, even some very gullible people will start, among the general public and so on, will start thinking, why were we lied to for the past 5 years? And, the same process that you and I went through 8, 9, 10 years ago. The more this happens, the more it will penetrate into the general public. And that's ultimately, that's where the change needs to come from. It needs to come from a sort of a groundswell of public support, which I think we're inching our way towards that, but I don't think we're anywhere near, a critical mass yet.
Yeah, we're not, but I do think that's what makes Ukraine important, because we have a dichotomy that's going on right now, thanks to Biden or whoever's running Biden, in the sense that we have so many problems domestically and we have a border that's intentionally porous. It's more than intentionally porous. There's an entire structure that our government paid for to funnel people in here. And as that's going on and people are suffering under the impacts of inflation and everything else, we have all this money that's being sent to Ukraine, and we're beginning to see this turn on that because of all the confluence of all of these events. That, wait a minute, I am seeing the effects of having an open border. I am feeling the effects every time I go to the store. And, wait a minute, it seems like our national debt is getting kind of high. The numbers are so big, they don't mean things to people, but they're starting to understand a little bit. And then meanwhile, you want to send more money to Ukraine, and you seem to be incessant about it. That seems to be the only thing you're really pushing for. It's starting to get people's attention. Like you say, it's going to take more time, but I do think that confluence of events is helping for people to start to open their eyes a little bit to what's really going on here.
Yeah, language is also very important in terms of how to convey this. Republicans are terrible at this. And I do agree with you that the fact that the whole Ukraine situation, in terms of the funding, just leaving aside the war itself or what's going on the ground over there, just in terms of the funding, there's really been this sort of shift. And That's very significant, and that impacts the whole lot of things we talked about. But communication is so important here. The shift could have been much more effective and much quicker, and we could have already been there if Republicans were better at communicating. Did you see that Biden put out this I was just like the statement, and he was in front of the camera. This was like a prefab. This is pre-recorded, and he could hardly get like string 5 words together. It was absolutely shocking. And okay, that's his degradation. We can talk about that some other time. But what he was talking about, did you see that about he changed the rules on credit card debt, and now you don't have to pay as many fees?
His late fee, yeah.
And it would save like $20 a family or whatever it was, right? And I'm like, hello, just the latest Ukraine package, just the most recent one, costs every American family $1,500. And he's doing his little videos about saving a couple of bucks here and there. That's how you need to communicate this, and that's kind of not being done. But of course, part of the problem is that many of these establishment Republicans want the Ukraine funding. Many of these Republican establishment people don't want to know about COVID. Many of them support Victoria Nuland. Everything we've talked about here today, they're on the wrong side of that. So you need to also break through that.
Yeah, well, but that's also part of the problem, is because I don't think it's just an inability to communicate. I think that goes back to kind of that establishment, the blob, whatever you want to call it. They don't want to communicate those things. So, there may be some incompetence, but a lot of it is because they're complicit in it and they don't have any desire to do it. The late fees was really pretty incredible, because here's the guy that engendered, or at least in large part, engendered the very inflation that led to the higher prices, which led to higher interest rates, which led to higher credit card balances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which then led to increased late payments that he's now giving people a little relief on the late fees that he helped to create in the first place. The irony of that is really something else.
Yeah, no, absolutely ridiculous. I think polls should ask people, do you support sending $1,500 per family to Ukraine in this next installment?
That's the same way that it should be handled in regards to the national debt.
If you phrase the poll that way,
as here's the number that we're asking you to pay for. Are you in favor of paying this much?
Right, because if you ask, do you support Ukraine funding? That could mean anything. So that's another thing that could happen. And yeah, we can blame the media for not, for doing these kinds of push polls or fake polls or whatever you want to call it. But you can do your own polls. Republicans can do their own polls. Republican-leaning media can do their own polls. They can ask their pollsters, please always specify when you ask these questions. Don't ask these general questions.
That's the same thing with the illegal side of things. People get much more upset when they understand the dollar amounts that are being given to people coming here illegally to help them. That, oh, by the way, they're going to get their rent covered for a year when people are struggling to pay their own rent. Those kind of things, when you specify it and place it in a perspective as opposed to the generalized issue, that's when people get upset, because then they see the comparison and can really, feel it appropriately. So like you said, yeah, everything should be specified. This is how much it's costing you. The numbers are so big and thrown around so easy they have no relevance. $1 trillion, $1 billion, $60 billion, $100 billion. It doesn't mean anything to anybody. $2,000 to you for this, it does mean something.
That's right. So there are some ideas for kind of breaking through the narrative, the deep state narrative, the entrenched bureaucracy narrative, whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, it's just going to take a long, long time. It's going to take a lot of persistence. It's going to take a lot of patience. And, there's going to be hiccups along the way. Like, the Biden presidency is this giant hiccup because, Trump was moving some of these things in the right direction. And then, of course, by Biden showing up, everything went like, 10 years back or worse in terms of, public perception. So it's going to be a long road ahead.
Yeah, and it's going to be a very bumpy next 9 months, too. I'm not particularly looking forward because things are going to get a lot worse, I think, from here in terms of the systemic reaction to the threat. But that's where we are, and I think most people are kind of prepared for it. So we'll see what happens.
you.